Wow. Oh, yeah, okay. You know where Asia is, right? You know, Ephesus is Asia. So he's staying in Ephesus. So last week he was in Ephesus. We had a great book burning last week. If you missed that, that was great. Great book burning of books that cost upwards of $1 million. Cult books, whoosh, up in flames. I mean, really quite a very productive time we had last week in Ephesus. Well, that was Ephesus part 1. So today we're coming to Ephesus part 2. That's what Ephesus looks like today if you visit as a tourist. And I should have taken another picture I've got because the ruins there in Ephesus are huge. This is a very small part of it, and I've never been there. There's one, I think maybe two large amphitheaters, you know, with the seats. So it was really, Ephesus was a going and blowing place at the time. We see it as the outskirts, it looks like, of Western Turkey, but I mean it was a big deal, and we'll talk about why in a couple minutes because it's going to be central to the discussion. Okay, so verse 23 in chapter 19. About that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. Yeah, what an understatement. And what kind of disturbance? Well, this kind of disturbance. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen, and he did stuff like this. That was my closest analog to what little, household shrines or altars look like, or something like that. And this guy, along with a bunch of craftsmen in town, they made a living making religious worship things for your living room that had to do with a very large mythical presence in Ephesus of the Temple of Artemis. Or that's the Greek name of the god, Artemis, a woman god. In Roman, it's Diana, so it's the god Diana. So it turns. Have you ever heard of the 7 wonders of the world? There's this guy about a century or so before Jesus who wrote his travelogues. He says, I've seen the 7 most wonderful things in the world. I've seen the pyramid in Gaza. I've seen the hanging gardens of Babylon. I've seen, I'm forgetting now. There's the statue of Zeus in Olympia. I've seen on the island of Rhodes, the Colossus statue. I've seen the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. It's in the top 7 of the biggest wonders of the world. So it really is a religious center. And these guys lived around the edges, making money for people who were into the mainstream worship of Artemis. Artemis, by the way, a female god, a hunter god, in terms of the entire pantheon of gods, and very old. I mean, this particular temple in Ephesus, man, it was built like 7 or 8 centuries before Jesus. I mean, it's very, very old, very old. And no one really knows exactly who made the first time in the temple. It was built several times. The one we're seeing right here, when Paul's there, was rebuilt after the death of Alexander the Great. So it's been there about 300 years. But way back 700, the biggest rumors are that the temple to Artemis, the huntress god, was built by the Amazons. And we're not talking the place you buy your soap from. Yeah, the Amazon women. So here's the little god. So he gathered together the craftsmen with the workmen in similar trades and said to them, hey, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth, right? Okay, well, and you see in here that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul, whenever anyone says your name like that, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that, can you believe this? Gods made with hands are not gods. Can you believe that? Well, this is interesting because we knew he made a big splash last week. We had the book burnings. We had all that kind of cult stuff being turned. But here, the gospel has come into Ephesus, and now it's actually cutting into the business of the guys making money off the cult. That's how you know that Paul was having a remarkable influence on the area, because now the guys who make their dough off of it are getting a little worried. Now, there's not just 1 or 2 people who are getting impacted on this stuff. There's a lot of people. So this guy, Demetrius, says, we got to do something like this. And he's actually getting people to believe that gods made with hands aren't gods at all. Of course, we know from the Old Testament and the New, that's true. They're not gods. But this is his living. So he goes on with all these other craftsmen. And there's danger. Okay, there's danger. Not only that this trade of ours will come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship. So here Demetrius has done a very clever thing. He started with, someone's cutting into our business. But you know what? It's the principle of the thing. He's actually cutting into the worship of Artemis, and all the world comes here to worship her. Oh yeah, so we gotta do something because Paul's being very unproductive for religion in the world. So he uses that as his civic argument, rather than the fact, hey, we're losing cash. We're losing cash. Yeah, okay. So he gets these guys all together in verse 28, and when they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So he gets them completely riled up, and a mob starts to form, and all they can do is shout this phrase over and over. It turns out that the temple of Artemis was such a big draw worldwide that these guys are getting all up in arms because Paul is actually dissing the reputation of one of the 7 wonders of the world, which brings people into Ephesus. You can't do that. So they start chanting to kind of overcome what's going on here. It gets worse. Yeah. So the city was filled with the confusion. What? Yeah, the confusion. And they rushed together into the theater. That's that big kind of amphitheater that's there in town. You can see it today, the pieces of it are there. They rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. They did this before. Remember that? They couldn't grab Paul, so they grabbed a couple of his guys. Hey, you're with him, right? Come here! And so they dragged him into this big amphitheater and decided to have this big thing happen with them. Paul's not with them, but they're going in there. By the way, Macedonians right there, that means they're the guys who are from the top of the Aegean of Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, that kind of area. So here he drags these guys into this big theater, can seat thousands of people. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples wouldn't let him. Let me at him. No, Paul, stay out of there. So they hold Paul back from jumping into the theater with his friends and these people, this mob that's got them, this confusion that's going on, and they hold Paul back and they won't let him get in the midst of it. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Don't go in there. So there's a mob in there. They're chanting, great is Artemis, and they've got 2 of his friends, and Paul's just itching to go in and get involved in this whole thing. Asiarchs is a conflation of the word, arch means ruler, high, number 1. Asia means Asia, that's Ephesus. So these are just high-placed rulers in the area that Paul's made friends with, because he's been in town here for 2 years. So even these guys who were sympathetic to Paul said, dude, don't go into the theater. Your 2 guys are in there, but you need to stay out of this. Just stay out of this. It's just a crazy thing going on. Well, now, some cried out one thing. These are the crowd, the mob. Some cried out something else. For the assembly was in confusion. This is just a crazy mob. And to cap off how confused they are, most of them didn't even know why they had come together. Sounded more like the internet to you these days? So here's this mob that Demetrius and his other silver craftsmen had gotten kind of incited and saying, look, this Paul's coming in and dissing Artemis, this god, and he's gonna completely change our life here, grab 2 people that are with Paul, drag them in the theater, and they're just going to have some kind of we don't know thing in the theater. But we now are accommodating thousands of people in this theater. And they're chanting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And the crowd is so confused that many of them don't even know why they're there. Hey, come on, we're going to go to the theater. We got some Paul's people. Let's chant some stuff. Okay, what are we chanting and why are we here? What? Huh? Reminds me of the riots in 2020. There's a lot of this kind of people were there. Why are you there? Well, I don't know. What are you trying to accomplish? Well, I'm not really sure, but So it's this kind of mob thing that Demetrius the silversmith has kind of whipped up. 33. So some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. Now, Alexander we don't think is a believer, but the Jewish community, which is minority in Ephesus, who are opposed to Paul, probably thought, let's bring up a reputable guy, Alexander, and let's put him, and at least, we agree with you, Ephesian cult people who are Gentile. We agree with you that this Paul's guy's a bad deal. So let's put Alexander, one of our guys' spokesmen, out there, and he'll at least kind of agree with you and say, yeah, we need to calm things down. So they brought him out, but it didn't work, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. You know how hard it is when you get a mob? They're loud and they're boisterous. They got a couple of hostages, and most of them don't even know why they're there. And they're not even chanting the same thing. And so Alexander is put in there by the Jews to kind of calm things down and to talk to. You go in there and talk to them. So he raises his hand, tries to talk to the crowd. Doesn't go anywhere. You wouldn't expect it to. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" 2 hours. 2 hours. I've always imagined Paul being outside the theater. Now, this is a big amphitheater, many stone seats going up the hillside. And all you hear for 2 hours is hundreds, maybe thousands of people inside this theater chanting this over and over for 2 hours. For 2 hours. Just crazed kind of stuff. And Paul's outside hearing this, wondering if his friends are okay. Man. Well, when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, not sure how he did this, but now he's going to reason with them. He's going to reason with them. So he says, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and the sacred stone that fell from the sky?" That's who we are. Great stone that fell out of the sky. Most historians and archaeologists believe that this temple was started to Artemis like 6 to 7 centuries before Jesus, because someone found a meteorite that they had seen come in, blazing its way in. They found it on the ground, and they said, clearly this has come from the heavens. Maybe this is a god. And that they actually made the central altar to Artemis with this meteorite in the center of it. Yeah. So anyway, he says, look, this is indisputable. This is who we are. This is what Ephesus is all about. So seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. So look, no matter what goes on, this Paul guy is not going to change the fact that, Artemis, she's our god. The meteorite, we've got it in the temple. We've got this great temple right here. All this fuss is not going to change the fact that we're Ephesians and we're identified with Artemis. By the way, have you ever seen a football game? And the football field is 100 yards long, and the width of it is, help me out here, I think it's about 150, 160 feet. So the temple to Artemis was a big rectangle, looked kind of like the Parthenon we saw on the top of the Acropolis in Athens, but its dimensions are this building with kind of stone columns is 1.5 times as long as a football field and almost 1.5 times wide. That's a whole building. And when you see it from a distance, all you see is white stone columns. And these columns are 60 feet tall. It's gigantic. How high is 60 feet in the air? Most telephone poles are 40 feet. So, and there was 120, 130 of these columns. So, I mean, this is a big thing. This is a seven wonders of the world destination, kind of the same ilk as the Egyptian pyramids. That's what we're talking about. A great source of pride. So what this guy who's from Ephesus is saying is that, look, this great source of pride, this temple to Artemis, all of this kind of stuff, you know what? This guy, Paul and his friends, they're not going to change the fact that this is our temple, this is our goddess, and nothing's going to change. So you just need to kind of chill. You need to chill. So that this is the ploy he's saying. Come, be quiet. Don't do anything rash. And he goes on. For you've brought these men here, probably the two friends of Paul. You brought these men here they're neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. Which is interesting. They're not actually saying, Artemis is a false god. Doesn't seem to be. He says they're not saying sacrilegious stuff. And then he goes on in 38. And if therefore Demetrius, the silversmith guy, if Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. Isn't that just a rational statement? And so I don't know how he got control of the crowd. But he basically said, as he's speaking for the central, the civic government in Ephesus, we have channels to deal with this, so just chill and we'll deal with it in channels. Somehow this is working. And he goes on. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. So that's an appeals court process. So if you still got a beef with these guys, even though they're not doing anything sacrilegious, they haven't said anything bad about our Artemis the goddess, even though if you still got problems, you can take it up with a higher court. Everything will be fine. And why is he saying this? So here's kind of the motivation. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. Well, they were so confused, they didn't know why they were anyway. I mean, it was just a crazy kind of deal. Why is that such a danger? Rome. Remember, Rome's big rule of thumb is keep the order, keep the order, keep the order. So if there's rioting in a city, even a very famous religious place like Ephesus, if there's rioting in a city and Rome gets wind of it, they will send legions to calm the rioting. They don't care who's at fault. They don't care what started it, what stopped it. They are going to put an end to it because there's nothing more important in the Roman Empire than order and peace in the places that they rule. So this guy's saying basically, look, if you keep this up, word's going to get to Rome and the nearest garrison. They're going to send people and they're going to kill us all just for the sake of bringing peace. That's how the Roman Empire brought peace to the world, by killing people. And if you raise a ruckus, they kill them too. So, that's kind of a nice way to do it. Are you causing a problem? Are you dissatisfied with how Rome's treating you? Yes. Well, too bad. Yeah, peace. Isn't that great? This is how Rome ruled the world. Peace through submission of the sword. So he's saying this could happen. And by the way, if they send someone to come here and ask us why we are so worked up, we'll have to tell them we don't really have a cause. And then they'll definitely go, well, forget it. And that'll be the end of that. So this is really a pretty good threat. It's a pretty good threat. He's talking as a municipal government employee, saying, guys, you got to let this go. We have channels. We have courts. We have ways of dealing with this. So just, chill. I don't know why this worked, but it did. Because when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. He's in this gigantic amphitheater in Ephesus. It's world renowned as well. And after he makes his pitch like this, he says, the Romans are going to come quell this if you don't quell yourself. And they go, yeah, okay. And they all walk out. Wow. Yeah. Well, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples. He's still in Ephesus. He's sending for the disciples that are there. And after encouraging them, these are the people who've come to the Lord in Ephesus, he said farewell and he departed for Macedonia. Bye. So after this big riot, and it's kind of quieted down. Now, Paul's been in Ephesus for quite some time, longer than most other places we know about. He's been there at least 2 years, probably 2+ years, between 2 and 3 years. So he's there, and after this whole thing gets quiet, he finally says, well, we're out of here. And he goes off to Macedonia, which is where Greece hits the continent up here, if that's Macedonia. So he goes off to Macedonia. Okay. Another Google Earth. So there we are. Paul's in Ephesus right there at the end of where he's come from in Antioch in the third tour. So now he's going to actually go up there. So Macedonia is everything between Berea, Thessalonica, and Philippi up there, that whole region, which he's been to before. He blazed that trail in the second tour. And so here he is again. He's going back to visit these people up here. And he walks out of the crisis in Ephesus. And Paul is not responsible for diffusing the crisis in Ephesus. Some town magistrate is. Wow. And presumably his 2 friends that got taken semi-hostage, the release, we don't hear anything that bad happened to them, so they leave. So he goes up to this upper part of Macedonia. So when he'd gone through these regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. Okay, picture again. So anyway, here we are. He's up in Macedonia up there. He encouraged them because he was thinking about them. It's been a couple years, more than a few years that he's been up there with those folks from the second tour. So he's encouraging them. By the way, some of the people that are with him, that are helping him on this third tour, are people that come from this area, that live in this area. You can trace their names through other, references Paul gives with his letters. They come from up here. So it's kind of going home for a lot of them. So he goes up there, and then, let's see. Yeah, goes down to Achaia, goes down to Greece. And Greece almost always means Athens for the cultured, but for Paul, it's Corinth. So he's come down to that part down there. Again, to encourage the people that were down there. And he had already written 2 letters to Corinth while he was in Ephesus. So in a way, he's ripped out these 2 letters, sent them by messengers. They've taken them over to Corinth, and now he's gone to Macedonia and down to Greece. And now he's going to follow up his letters. And the first word he's going to say to them when he comes into town in Corinth is, "So, did you get my letters?" Because, if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they're kind of in your face. There's some heavy-duty topics in there. So now Paul is following up his letters with a personal visit. Says, let's talk about my letters. So how's it going? That's what this trip right here is. He's following up right there. We have no narrative about what happens here, which is probably good because it was probably pretty heated at the time based on the content of the 2 letters. So he spent 3 months there down in this Greece, Achaia level down here. He spent 3 months there. And when a plot was made against him, against him by the Jews as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. So things get hot again someplace else. He's there for 3 months. He's ready to set foot on a boat to Syria. Remember, we have 2 Antiochs, Antioch in Pisidia in the middle of Turkey, and Antioch in Syria. He's going home. He's getting ready to get on a boat and go home. But then he gets wind of this plot and he decides, I'm not getting on the boat. I'm walking back up to Macedonia. Which makes a lot of people think that the plot was to dump him in the ocean. Like, when it gets on the boat, throw him over the side. Yeah, that's what it'll do. Oh, I'm walking to Macedonia, never mind. So that's what happens. He goes to Macedonia, and with him is a group of guys. Sopater the Berean, so he's from up there, his son of Pyrrhus, he accompanied him. Also of the Thessalonians, remember, Thessalonica up there, Aristarchus and Secundus. I'll talk about them in a second. It's interesting names. And Gaius of Derbe. Remember, Derbe's right smack dab in the middle of Turkey, one of the first places he ever hit. Gaius of Derbe. And Timothy, of course, who was picked up in Lystra, I think it was. I forget. And the Asians, which means, people there in Ephesus, Tychicus and Trophimus. These are kind of his bodyguards, these 7 guys. These 2 guys, these Thessalonian guys, Aristarchus and Secundus. Aristarchus is kind of like the word for aristocrat. Privileged leaders and stuff like that, people with elite powered people, kind of like that. So Aristarchus, just based on his name, clearly comes from a privileged, powered, moneyed position. He's a man of influence and wealth, just by his name, Aristarchus. You can go, oh, Aristarchus. If anyone ever just introduced you to Aristarchus, say, hi, this is Aristarchus, and you go, ooh, Aristarchus, you must be a somebody, just based on his name. But the name of the guy with him is more interesting. Secundus. If you owned slaves, you didn't use their first names. You use the number of the slave. Number 1, number 2. It's kind of like Star Trek. Number 1, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Now, the number 1 was called Primus, and the number 2 was called Secundus. Yeah. So here we've got a guy, Aristarchus, who is clearly by his name a man of power, influence, and position, who's traveling from Thessalonica with someone's slave. Maybe his own slave. We just don't know. But when you see the fact that here we have 7 people who are engaged full-time with helping Paul do the ministry, there's an aristocrat listed right alongside a slave. And not even a prime slave, a secondary slave. That's kind of cool. We see that all through the New Testament. God is no respecter of persons, whether you're well-heeled or whether you're a slave. Christ is for you. That's what's really great about it. And that's what you see right there when you see these two guys from Thessalonica doing that. That's great. You will see a lot of these other names, Tychicus and Trophimus. You'll see names show up at the end of Paul's letters as he references them. Okay, so he's there, and now what's going to happen is these guys are all going to go back up into the Macedonia area. That's that orange squiggle right there. So those 7 guys and Paul, they all end up going up that direction. And then these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. So hold your thinking. We'll get a map here in a second. They were waiting for us in Troas, but we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And in 5 days, we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. You can't know a player without a program. So here's the map. So they are all up there in Macedonia, somewhere up there in Macedonia. The 7 guys plus, they all get on a boat probably and go to Troas. We've been to Troas before. They go that way. But Paul doesn't go to Troas immediately. Instead, he actually goes up to Philippi. And then it says what we just read, that from Philippi, he waits until after the holidays. And after the holidays, he goes down to Troas. And he meets them in Troas. So that's where we are. Now, this whole picture right here of these travels on the left here are interesting because we have no narrative at all of what happened in that whole rat's nest of the travels on the left there. just none at all. So now in the narrative, we get to a point where we're just going to focus right here in little Troas. Remember, Troas was the place where Paul was trying to go different places and the Holy Spirit wouldn't let him. And then he had this vision of the Macedonian man saying, "Come help us." And then he gets on a boat from Troas and he goes across the water and he ends up in Philippi. And that's where that started. Well, Troas was that launching place. Troas. So now we're back in Troas again. And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. So we're at the cusp of the second of the crazy things going on here in Acts. So he's in Troas. By the way, I will point out to you, since we did this some time ago, pronouns are important, and the pronoun we is being used by the author of Acts right here. And he hasn't used this pronoun since chapter 16. From 16, the pronoun of the author was they, and now all of a sudden it switches back to we. Well, if you do a little investigative work, you remember the author of Acts is Luke, so when he says we, he's talking about Luke and the guys. If you look back in 16, they made it up to Philippi, and it was we to Philippi. And then when they went up to the rest of Macedonia, it was they. Going down to Greece, they. Back to Macedonia, they. And then when they turned back to Philippi just now, and then came to Troas, it was we. So it looks like Luke was picked up on the trail. You know what town he was picked up in, by the way? Troas. He started in Troas, and then it was we into Philippi. So it looks as though all these travels we've been looking at recently, Luke stayed behind in Philippi. And now that Paul has come back to Philippi before the boat to Troas, Luke got back on the boat with him and starts. From this point on, we get back to we. So Luke has rejoined him right here as he comes back to Troas, which is hometown for him. Okay, so Paul is speaking. They break bread. They have a meal together. He intends to depart the very next day. And when we say depart, we mean get on a boat and go home to Antioch. I mean, he's bringing to the end of this third tour. But he prolonged his speech until midnight, which is exactly what I plan to do today. Just to demonstrate what it feels like. No, we won't do that. But he prolonged his speech until midnight. And there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered. So Luke's up there with them. So it's really dark. Have you ever been in a room with a lot of incandescent lamps? I mean, like oil lamps and stuff like that. And it gets kind of closed in, and you get that smell of the oil. All that kind of. This is what's going on up there. It's getting kind of stuffy, smelling kind of oily, and it's getting to be midnight. And isn't it time to go to bed, Paul? And he's still going. He's still talking. So there are many lamps in the upper room. Luke is setting the stage for what happens next. Well, what happens next? A young man named Eutychus was sitting at the window. Yeah, and he sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. The Greek for sank into deep sleep it really means he was fighting it. I mean, he was really struggling to stay awake. But hey, if you're struggling to stay awake, don't sit in the window. Because being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and he was taken up dead. Oh, I thought you said this was going to be fun. Well, I think it's kind of amusing if you don't. It's odd. Okay, so he's, and right there when it says he was taken up dead, the way Luke has written it here, he was dead. Not just sort of looked dead, not just mostly dead. He was dead. That's it. They looked out, they said, you fall from a 3rd story window, and you're not controlling your fall even if you could, and they go down and say, it's dead. Wow. What a bad way to finish your 3rd tour for Jesus, by killing some kid by speaking too long. Oh, man. Yeah. Gee whiz, I just hate when that happens. So Paul went down, comes down the 3 floors, comes down, bent over him, and taking him in his arms said, oh, it's okay, don't be afraid, his life is still in him. What? Yeah, no, there's life in him still. There's life in him? Yeah, okay. What? Well, again, there's debate about whether he just looked kind of dead and Paul just lifted him up and shook him a bit and he went, oh, what happened? But actually, the way that it's written and the way that Luke describes it, we're talking death here. So sure enough, he comes back to life. Don't be alarmed. His life is in him. So Paul went up and broke bread and ate. Wait, what about the boy? Well, Paul went up and he ate some more, midnight snacks. Well, what about the boy? We want to know about the boy. Well, he went up and he had some, and then he conversed with them for some time. How long? Well, he was there for a long time. He was talking up there. We're post midnight again. Well, what about the boy? Was he okay? Well, he conversed with them a long time. You know how long he spoke to them? He'd already pushed things by going to midnight. He spoke up there so long while we're wondering what happened to the little boy. He spoke until daybreak. Well, what about the boy? Storytelling. I want to tell Luke, you need to finish the story about the boy. I don't care about how long Paul spoke, even if he did. He was pushing it to go to midnight. Now he's gone all the way to daybreak. Man, that Paul can talk. Well, okay, here we go. And then Paul left, and okay, there we go. And they took the youth away alive, and they were not a little comforted. Well, I'm comforted. I finally got the story down. So Paul talks this kid to sleep. He comes down, hits the ground dead. Paul goes down and lifts him up and says, oh, there's a little life here. Everything's fine. Then Paul goes back up and has something to eat and then continues talking for another, 6 or 7 hours. And then they say, oh, the boy's fine. Everything's good. Oh, gee whiz. They were not a little comforted. Okay, we're going to stop there today because that's enough of the craziness. When we come back to Acts next time, which will be in 2 weeks, because we're going to take a break for Palm Sunday and Easter coming up. But the next time we come back into this narrative in Acts, we come to what I consider probably the most touching, tender, warm, full of tears section of all of Acts. It's just a stunningly warm thing. It's interesting. It's preceded by Paul talking this kid to death in Troas and the crazy riot where no one even knew why they were chanting. It's preceded by craziness. But when we come back, you can read ahead, by the way. It's in 20. It's really cool. Just really touchingly warm. And many times when people want to reference into Acts, they'll reference 2 or 3 very famous places, and this next place is one of those places. It's a wonderful thing. So let's do a few observations, and then we'll call it quits because I am not going to midnight. So here's a couple. If we go back, this riot at Ephesus, it was all triggered because of money. Did you notice that? There's a sense in which many times when the gospel comes into an area and it starts to be embraced, it's gonna wreck someone's cash flow eventually. And so when that happens, there's opposition to the gospel not because of doctrinal reasons, but because of income reasons. Many people also, in a larger sense, they may not like Demetrius and make money off of little shrines and stuff like that to false doctrines, but they do make money based on deceit and lying. And that's really quite rife in our culture. So when someone who comes to Christ and the Holy Spirit starts to impress upon them the problem with lying and deceit, even in the company that they might work for, it starts to throw a monkey wrench in how money's made in a lot of people's places. There's so much income that's based on that. So Demetrius starts this mob on purpose in order to protect his own income. So here you have this idea where Jesus, someday he's going to face this Demetrius guy and say, Demetrius, you completely tried to torpedo the gospel because of your income? I mean, really? This is what's going on here. But Demetrius also recognizes that since he's making hand over fist money from these people in town, he can't really push that narrative very hard, because they're going to say, yeah, man, you ripped me off last time. I went down to this guy down the street and he gave me a shrine for half the price that you gave me, Demetrius. You're just ripping everybody. So, he's got his own customers to protect, but he realizes he can't push the commerce thing too hard. So he enlarges it to, well, it's a cultural issue. We're going to be dissed around the world because Paul's saying that Artemis is not a god. And so he brings up that many times when you have things pushed up against the gospel, and it's not doctrinal issues, it's income issues, starts with that, then many times smart people who want to oppose the gospel will find larger, what is on the principle of the thing that we oppose it, which is what he did here. Because we are identified. Our reputation of Ephesus is identified with Artemis. So he broadens it to that. Also, this confusion and this sloganeering and this force, it's a very typical response. When a crowd gets whipped up and they don't even know why they've gotten whipped up. And this should tell you something about our susceptibility to being whipped up and not even knowing why we're saying what we're saying. There is a group effect that can happen, and people can very easily take advantage of this group effect. So much so that people get together and going, yeah, we're together! Woohoo! Why are we here? Yeah, we're here. And there's this confusion. I'd like to say this is a mass crowd effect that went out of style in the first century. But it's not. We see this to this very day. This is exactly what goes on. And why are you here today, and what are you trying to accomplish? The news reporter asks. Well, we're here today. I don't know what we're trying to accomplish. Woo-hoo! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And why do you want to see change? I don't know. I'm just here with them. So see, this kind of goes on today. And you see it not only in person on the streets, but you see it in clouds on the internet. So just saying, we are all still susceptible to this. It often does turn into force. Remember, they took those two guys by force. So it'll involve not only the passion of words, but it'll include the passion of collected people and the passion of actually just grabbing people. So this still happens today. Yeah. Most of them didn't know why they had come together. That's how crazy irrational it is. And that's it's largely why Paul didn't engage with them, because it would have been a waste of time. It's a total waste of time. Let me just say, Paul realized that staying out was important. Like, you're not going to get anything done, Paul, if you go in there. But Paul itched twice and was held back by two different groups of people saying, no, don't go in there. You're not going to do anything for the gospel in there. It also is a way to explain why it is that when Jesus was arrested and he was presented to the mobs by Pilate, and they're crying, great is Artemis, no, crucify him. They don't even know why. And in many respects, it's this crowd effect still going on. And that's why Jesus didn't respond either. Because there's nothing he could say to really change the mob's opinion. Even when he gets up in front of Pilate, his answers to Pilate are very short, So there is a real effect right here when we talk about sharing the gospel, talking about who Jesus is. There is good context to do it, and there's other contexts where it's just going to be a waste of time. And in this particular case, they were trying to impress upon Paul. It would be a waste of time. This is just not the right context. Because basically you can't reason with fools. So when people get into fool mode, you can't reason with them. And if you've been frustrated trying to hold civil conversations with people online, and say, well, no, can I talk about, I got 3 points you need to think about and consider, and you wonder why it's sort of bouncing off. There's a little bit of the crowd effect going on right here. And it's so pervasive, in fact, that when you engage someone with counterpoints that are actually well thought out and they're rational and they're logical, and you just want to have a back and forth, just a little bit, what do you think of that kind of stuff? When it really does happen, you're surprised. That's how infrequent it is. Well, that has been part and parcel of a lot of what goes on the internet. Now, I'm not anti-internet, but I'm saying that the mob mentality finds some of its best manifestations on the internet, with people separated and they're not even a mob together. So just watch out. Sometimes it's not really worthwhile to share too much there. Okay, so here's my internet verses. You ready? These are really great because it applies to this mob mentality as well. Proverbs 18:2. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. Oh man. How about this one? Proverbs is great. Proverbs 20 verse 3. It's an honor for a man to keep aloof from strife, but every fool will be quarreling. So it's actually an honor to keep aloof from strife. So say, I'm not going to get involved in this. There's a lot of craziness going on. I'm not going to get involved in this, because the fools are actually, that's what they want to do, is quarrel. They want to argue. What are we arguing about? I don't know, but I'm going to win. So that's what's going on. Another proverb right here. This is great. Proverbs 29, verse 11. I got to tell you, these are hitting home for me. I don't know if they are for you. A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Yeah. In fact, there's another proverb I didn't list for you where it basically says, a fool can actually look like a smart guy if he just stops talking. That's my quote of that. And there's another one where it says, I'm going to misquote this as well. What you need to do if you've got Bible software, take the word fool and have it pop up whatever's in Proverbs. I got to tell you, you'll laugh all day long. There's one where it says, you can make more progress with a wise man, you can make more progress with a wise man than you can with 100 hits of a stick on a fool. Something like that. So anyway, okay, so there we go. But, it's not only in Proverbs. Jesus himself said, don't give dogs what's holy. Don't throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. So there really is an appropriate time to talk about the gospel, to talk about Jesus, with ears that are ready to listen, and the Holy Spirit can then change something in their hearts. And there's also a time where, you just need to sort of step back and go, man, not today. Not today. It's just not going to work. Not today. Okay. I just want to point this out because I found it just fascinating here. Remember that magistrate who made things happen? Authorities, they can preserve order. And when Jesus talked about giving to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's, the things that Caesar does that you're indebted to Caesar for in terms of governments in general is the order that they provide. And Paul talks about this later in some of his letters. They really do have a legitimate function. They do preserve order. Now, are they righteous rulers? Not often. But one thing that they many times do is they preserve order, even if it's a cost of killing everybody like the Romans do. But they do preserve order. So it turns out that in this particular case, the gospel was helped by the fact that a municipality kind of brought order to a crazy situation. Now, I mention that because many times we look at our involvement with government and municipalities. We say, well, I want to spread the gospel. I want to talk about who Jesus is. I'm not sure that the government is really my ally in that. Well, they're not your ally in that. However, what they do provide, which you need to respect, is order. So that's kind of cool, because without that order, you wouldn't have a rational context to talk about who Jesus is. So that's a good thing. You need to support your local government, even the larger government, because in a way, they provide a way that the gospel can go forward in a way that couldn't without them. And God's the one who institutes that power for those authorities. Not saying God endorses the crazy, sinful things they do, but the outgrowth of government in general is order. And you can work with that. You can work with that. So I just want to make that point because he was really influential. Okay, and let's move on to the all-nighter in Troas. the all-nighter in Troas. Well, Paul's passion to equip people with the word is really on big display right here. That's what it is. They couldn't believe that he was talking till midnight, and they couldn't believe he kept talking till daybreak. That's another 6 hours. So the question at hand is, why was Paul so passionate to spend so much time talking with the people in Troas? I mean, what is that all about? After all, he just spent 2+ years in Ephesus, so he really was talking a lot to them. When he was down in Achaia and Greece and Corinth, they spent at least 3 months down there. I mean, this is what Paul does. So why, in this last-ditch, desperate attempt almost, it sounds like, to spend all these back-to-back hours in Troas, what is the reason for that? And you'll be able to figure it out when we read the next section. You can read ahead. Yeah, you can read ahead if you want to, but you'll see why. You'll see why, because this just seems like, man, Paul, just, kind of let it go. You killed a kid. See what you did? You killed a kid. No, but it's really quite a passion that he has. There are many times when we look at the gospel, we look at the truth that Paul's speaking about, and we see it as he came into different areas, as he spoke and taught about who Jesus was. That truth, that word changed everything. It's the promotion of that information that starts the ball rolling in people's hearts. And Paul even says in Romans 10, he says people need to believe, but then how are they going to believe if they don't hear? I mean, the truth. And how will they hear if no one tells them? And then how will anyone tell them if someone isn't sent to tell them? He's actually giving you sort of a bio on what he's done through this region. So he's saying, the gospel makes its inroads rationally as we hear rationally the truth about who Jesus is. Engages the minds. That doesn't always twist people's arm to accept Jesus. In fact, it doesn't at all. But it starts with the rational acceptance of the truth of who Jesus is. And so Paul is here investing deeply in a many-hour discussion. It's probably very likely he's been there starting from dinner time, because there was breaking of bread, until he had to eat again sometime after midnight. So that's like 6 hours in, another 6 hours out. I mean, he could be there 10 to 12 hours talking. Who talks about Jesus for 10 to 12? Could you talk about Jesus for 10 to 12 hours? Well, if there was food, I probably could. I don't know. So you'll see that. You'll see that passion why later as we go into the next section. So it's kind of cool. Okay, so it really is possible. But here's what he told Timothy. Now, Timothy, remember, Timothy is one of two young pastors, Timothy and Titus, that Paul is training up to kind of fill his shoes later on. This is the last thing that we know of that Paul wrote to Timothy, his last advice to him. Now, see if you can hear the riots and all that stuff, and even these discussions in his words and his advice to Timothy. 2 Timothy 2, last letter, Paul to Timothy, verse 23. Look, have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant, though, must not be quarrelsome, but must be kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. And guess what? God may perhaps grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth. And they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. Now, is that a wise man speaking or what? Don't get involved in these quarrels. And in fact, according to the magistrate there, he didn't diss Artemis of the Ephesians. There was none of that was there. And interestingly enough, then what that means is you can go into an area and completely turn it on its head by not attacking Artemis of the Ephesians, but promoting Jesus. That's the big deal. That's where you go when you talk about transformation. And here it turns out when you look at the history of the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, right about here it starts a very long-term turn down. I mean, it was a going and blowing thing for 7, maybe 8 centuries at this time. Been rebuilt 3 times. I mean, it's the momentum of the worship of the gods in that whole area. But when Christianity comes to town, the threat is obvious. Demetrius saw it. Other people saw it. They didn't diss Artemis. They talked about Jesus. And as Christianity grew in that area, it became really quite a hub. We looked at all of Asia last week in terms of the letters to the churches in Revelation. They're all in that area, right? It came out of this 2 years in Ephesus. huge inroads for the gospel, for who Jesus was. It's the news about who Jesus is that transforms an area, and not you criticizing the evil that people participate in. Isn't that interesting? Now look, evil's bad, and if someone asks my opinion, should I be involved in this evil, I'll say, well, no, I don't think so. But you really make gains for the gospel if instead you put Jesus in front and say, well, that's a good question, but can I talk about Jesus for a while? Can I talk about him for the next 12 hours? Can we talk about Jesus for a while? And in that process, people come, like he says right here, God may grant them repentance leading to a knowledge of the truth. Something might happen if you do this gently rather than arguing and being argumentative and something might happen. God might have in store for them a change that you can't even anticipate. Even people who are up to their eyeballs in evil. Just talk gently about who Jesus is. Put him out there clearly. And then God might grant them repentance. And then, gosh, who knows what can happen after that? That's how it works. That's how it works. Thanks, Paul. That's exactly right. Whew. 12 hours talking about Jesus? Could you? I don't think I could. Yeah. Okay, we're going to sing this because that's exactly what that truth did for us. It freed us from the captivity of sin, and that's exactly what God's accomplishing through Paul promoting the gospel and the truth in Ephesus and all the places he's going. We're free from the captivity of sin. Okay, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your great, persistent, loving kindness toward us. And we thank you that even while we were spouting crazy things, we didn't even know why, that in your patience, you spoke your truth to us through those that were around us, and you granted us repentance because you're the one that brought us to yourself. And you've changed us. And all those things in which we were embroiled and entangled and ensnarled and all that stuff we're in the midst of that we really didn't know was being self-destructive, you changed that. You changed that. And all we did was give our hearts to Jesus and focus on who he was. And said, God, I want life from you. I don't want life from all this stuff. I want life from all this stuff. It's you and you alone. You alone are the source of life. You alone give breath to all things that walk. You are the one that gives life and gives it abundantly. So, Father, thank you for rescuing us. Thank you for buying us back. Thank you through the cross of Christ that we can now be part of your plan for life. So thanks now in Jesus' name. Amen.